Well, thank you. Ömer doesn't need an introduction, but I would be completely useless
That's my
if I didn't. He's the director of the Turkey program at the Brookings Institution, and he's a professor of national security strategy at the U.S. National War College. And he will talk about Armenia-Turkey relations and the future of the relations. And I would like to give a very brief introduction. For as many of you know, for a decade and a half, the bilateral relations between Turkey and Armenia have been strained by disagreements about issues including how to address a common past and compensate for crimes and territorial disputes and Armenian occupation of Azerbaijani land. But recently, starting from 2008, actually, intense official engagement, civil society interactions, and public opinion change have transformed the bilateral relations, bringing both sides on the brink of a historical agreement to open borders and start diplomatic relations. In October 2009, an agreement, an accord between the two countries were signed to start the diplomatic relations and open borders. But recently, things unfortunately got complicated, and the process which was considered, which raised hopes on both sides, reached almost a dead end by the genocide resolution and Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan's hinting at deporting Armenian illegal workers. So Ömer will take over. So what's next?
If only I knew. Thank you, Gönül, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to Rumi Forum as well for hosting this. What I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a good Q&A, is to talk about the background of what's going on. Why are we here? The risks involved in the current situation. To try to give you a kind of Turkish political context overview, something that I'm more familiar with than the Armenian side, but to try to understand why are we at this point now. And when I say the risks, the risk I'm referring to this is the risk of raised expectations. Because now I think if we end up with failure, and failure can be defined as a failure to ratify the two protocols, I think we will be at a point where there will be so much frustration, so much lost hope, that we may be really at a more negative point than where we started this reconciliation process. So in that sense, we are in this critical time, and what's going to happen next, probably in the next year or so, will be vitally important in terms of Turkish-Armenian relations. Before I start about analyzing the background, let me give you a concept that I tried to explain in an article that I wrote for today's Zaman, an op-ed that I wrote for today's Zaman, the day after the protocols were signed in Zurich. And I'll try to go over this because I think it does a good job in terms of explaining what I really want you to understand, this concept of two traumatized nations. We're dealing with essentially two historical traumas here. On the one hand, you have the trauma of a country, the Turkish Republic, that carries the Ottoman legacy. On the other hand, you're dealing with Armenia, a country that's whole existence is built on the collective memory of the genocide. So without understanding these traumas, it's very difficult to understand the political context and the limits of what can be done. And I started that op-ed by saying, by referring to the crisis that was experienced during the signature ceremony. Those of you remember that was in October in Zurich, and Turkish delegation and the Armenian delegation basically wanted to see their statements after the signature ceremony. And because the Armenian delegation's declaration after the signature ceremony referred to the genocide, And because the Turkish one made allusions to a different concept, something that Davutoğlu had drafted, the foreign minister. Back then, I guess, was he the foreign minister? Yes, he was the foreign minister. There was a crisis. And for a while, there was this sense that there would be no signature, that the signature would not be possible of these two protocols because of the tension between the two delegations about what was going to be said after the signature ceremony. And here's how I start. As we once again have witnessed over the weekend, Turkey and Armenia are two traumatized nations. Reconciliation between these two nations will be much more difficult than a crisis-prone signature ceremony. So in a way, that crisis itself was enough to show you how difficult this would be. The signature ceremony itself was, I think, quite telling in terms of the difficulties that one could face, because not only you needed to have the signature ceremony, but you needed the parliamentary ratification of these two protocols, both in Turkey and Armenia. And in many ways, I think many people shared my concern that the signature ceremony would be the easier part. Parliamentary ratification would be the more difficult part. I went on to argue in the article that liberal intellectuals from Turkey and Armenia can communicate in English and manage to distance themselves from ethnic nationalism. In a way, this is something that is happening, and this is the good news story. I think you have an increasing number of people in Turkey who are able to look at what happened in 1915 and at the history from a less ethnic nationalist angle, and an angle that would try to empathize a little bit more with the Armenian narrative. But I argued that for ordinary Turks and Armenians who do not have the luxury of having this liberal intellectual approach, there's no such luxury. The narrative of nationalism will still be there. And there's the crucial factor of the Armenian diaspora. The diaspora, I argued, will be always more intransigent than Armenia itself. And here in the parenthesis, we have to understand that the diaspora is a big issue, and there's a huge literature on diaspora nationalism, on basically how people in the diaspora cling much more strongly to the collective memory. And oftentimes, they want integration in the communities that they live, they're part of, but they also want to avoid total assimilation. They also want to have a strong memory of who they are, where they come from. And for the diaspora, I would argue, the genocide is such an integral part of who they are, that they will always be more intransigent than people in Armenia itself, who tend to be more pragmatic, who basically, of course, are also very attached to the idea of the collective memory, but they have to be more pragmatic simply because of the political, economic reality of Armenia, that they need to have basically an approach that takes into consideration the daily difficulties of living in a small, relatively underdeveloped country. Whereas for the diaspora, the idea of basically putting a question mark behind what happened in 1915 is not acceptable. I will come back to that point because I think that's an integral part of the problem. When I say liberal intellectuals have an easier time to understand what happened in 1915, I'll refer to one example. Let me read you this sentence, and I think you will be able to recognize what this sentence is about. This is how it starts. My conscience does not accept the insensitivity showed to and the denial of the great catastrophe that the Ottoman Armenians were subjected to in 1915. I reject this injustice, and for my share, I empathize with the feelings and pain of my Armenian brothers and sisters. I apologize to them. Can any one of you recognize what this sentence is about?
Yeah, it was the online campaign, the petition campaign that was originated in Turkey.
Yes, an online petition campaign originated in Turkey that did not refer to the term genocide, but that refer to the fact that my conscience does not accept the insensitivity showed to and the denial of the great catastrophe. And the great catastrophe is correct me if I'm wrong, is the Armenian term Meds again, used in Armenian, which refers to the genocide. That the Ottoman Armenians were subjected to in 1915. I reject this injustice, and for my share, I empathize with the feelings and pain of my Armenian brothers and sisters. I apologize to them. Can you take a guess of how many people basically signed up for this petition in Turkey?
30,000.
30,000. This is not a small number, given the debate in Turkey, given the fact that for even university professors in Turkey, acquaintance with this problem, a knowledge of what happened, access to non-Turkish sources were so limited for a very long time. To this day, if I'm correct, you have very few, probably less than 5 or 6 Turkish historians, intellectuals, I would say historians, academic historians, who basically are in total convergence with the mainstream of history that what happened in 1915 was genocide. So in that sense, such a angle which argues that what happened in 1915 was a great catastrophe and that there's a need to apologize to Armenians is something very newly discussed in Turkey. And I would not minimize the number of people who signed this. This is 30,000 people, and it was spearheaded by a group of 500 intellectuals who put first their signature, and there was a huge campaign about this. So this shows that I think there is hope as far as intellectuals are concerned in Turkey, liberal intellectuals are concerned. The problem remains in the nationalist narrative, of basically the media, the education system, and overall politics. The fact that you have to win elections in Turkey, and it's very difficult for a political party to win elections in Turkey without playing to the nationalist narrative. So in that sense, the difficulty is not, I think, between intellectuals, and I think there would be an equivalent, a parallel image of this kind of narrative in Armenia too, who would empathize with Turkey's dilemmas in terms of Turkey's democratization, in terms of the context of 1915, putting 1915 in a context, why this happened. We can call it whatever we want. We can call it massacre, deportation, genocide, but why this happened. And here I think there is hope, even at the political level, because I will refer to what the Foreign Minister Davutoglu recently argued in terms of the need to have a just collective memory. He apparently had the chance to give the talk in Zurich that he wanted to give, the declaration after the signature, he would have referred to the just memory, adil hafıza concept in terms of remembering what happened in 1915, which essentially is code word for let's remember the context. The Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. The Ottoman Empire was fighting in the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli War, the Yemen War, the Balkans. Turks lost basically 3 to 5 million people during this imperial disintegration process, and you have to understand the trauma that Turkey experienced. So in that sense, if you want to understand the trauma dimension of the problem, you can easily empathize with Turkey as well, along the lines of basically an empire disintegrating in 1915 and a sense of panic, a sense of fear of survival. All these elements are there. What bothers me as someone who himself signed to this petition and tried to argue that this is the right policy is that this should not come basically as an excuse for what happened in 1915. In my opinion, and here we're getting into the what should happen next, I think Turkey should find ways to really empathize with the Armenian diaspora, Armenian public, and should not try to say, look, what happened in 1915 was terrible, but try to understand where we were. Try to understand what kind of problems we were facing. Because inherently, those are not the Armenian community's problems. The Armenian community cannot share the responsibility for what happened during the 19th century, during the Ottoman disintegration. Ottoman disintegration in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, created a sense of survival, a sense of fear, a sense of panic, the victim of which became the Armenian minority of Anatolia. And in that sense, to try to explain what happened to the Armenians based on what was happening in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I think would not go very far in terms of creating empathy for Armenians themselves. In that sense, there are some limits to what I think Professor Davutoğlu and the Turkish narrative of just memory can accomplish. What is part of the common memory, I think, and what can be also emphasized, is that the context involves Armenian nationalism. Armenians wanted to have their own state. And this is something that I would like to refer again in the op-ed that I wrote. I argued, let me read the paragraph where I talk about the Turkish trauma first, and then I'll get to the Armenian trauma. In order to fully understand the roots of the drama that unfolded in Zurich, we need to understand that the Turkish and Armenian psyche. We also need to ask what brings these two people to the negotiating table. Let's start with the Turkish psyche. Turks have lost an empire in an agonizingly slow fashion. For 200 years, Ottomans lost war after war to modern Western enemies. The unraveling was even more traumatizing inside the empire. Unable to understand the power of ethnic nationalism, the ruling elite, the Ottoman elite that is, came to the conclusion came to hate, and distrust ethnic minorities. The empire was at a loss as internal nationalisms led to separatism. Finally, Turkish nationalism emerged as the last nationalism of the empire in reaction to all previous nationalisms, and it emerged with a vengeance. Its main objective was to save what was left of the empire. Here I would like to emphasize one point. When I say the empire was at a loss as internal nationalisms led to separatism, I'm saying that it was at a loss in terms of identifying a kind of ethnic project for itself. Up until the İttihat Terakki movement, the unionist movement, the Ottomans still cling to the idea that there was an Ottoman identity, that you could save the empire based on a kind of pan-Ottoman project. And they were reluctant. The Ottoman Sultan and the Ottoman bureaucracy, the ruling elite, was reluctant in terms of adopting an ethnic identity for itself because it could have been counterproductive in terms of saving the empire. There was still this attachment to a kind of civic Ottoman identity. But of course it led to nowhere because the power of nationalism was too strong. Armenians, like Turks, were also latecomers to nationalism. They wanted their own state, just like the Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians. But they were a century too late. It was only a matter of time before Turkish nationalism and such Armenian national aspirations were to confront each other. What followed is tragic. Armenian nationalism begot Turkish wrath, Turkish anger. More than 1 million Armenians were wiped out from their territories. The majority were massacred during deportations. Once the empire was gone, Turkey embarked on the most radical westernization program the Islamic world ever witnessed. And I argue here that Turks are still not accepted as a Western country by the European Union or the West in general because of this Orientalist approach that they're Muslim, but they also have basically the burden of history. And the Armenian issue is part of the reason why there is this prejudice towards Turkey that basically this is a country that has not come to terms with its history. In that sense, the Turkish trauma is very much there, alive. There is a kind of inferiority complex towards the West. There is an attempt to emulate the West, but there is also distrust towards the West because there is this feeling that the West played a major role in terms of inciting internal ethnic minorities of the Ottoman Empire to their own nationalist project. The Russians supported the Greek and Armenian nationalisms. The Brits supported basically Arab nationalism. The French supported the Catholic communities of the Ottoman Empire. So there's this distrust of the West in Turkey, which creates this trauma, which is most visible today in the Kurdish question. But if you want to understand Turkish situation today, the Turkish political context today, you also have to refer to this Turkish trauma and the way Turkey looks at the West, wants to emulate the West, wants to be part of the West, but cannot trust the West in many ways. So the Armenian trauma is very much based on the genocide, as I said. And as if this was not enough, you have the additional trauma of the region. There's a more recent trauma that we're dealing with, and that needs to be addressed as well in the context of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan too is a traumatized nation. Azerbaijan too had basically its own share of this traumatized context. And it's a more recent trauma, in many ways based on the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh. A defeat, a narrative of victimization, a narrative of basically we have lost our land and we are the victims of this, and this is not just, this is unjust. And in that sense, the external dimension, the external dynamics in this Turkish-Armenian process are very important, especially given the fact that one of the reasons why Turkey is unable to go forward and ratify the two protocols that are about to, that are the protocols that are supposed to open the border and are supposed to start diplomatic relations, is based on the fact that Turkey has decided that Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan should be part of almost a precondition that the withdrawal of Armenian troops from some regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh is a precondition. So the Azeri trauma is also now part of this Turkish and Armenian traumas, and it's only complicating matters. To basically give you a context of the Turkish political situation today and why we are at a very difficult conjuncture, I think things would have been much more easier in terms of ratifying the protocols for Turkey had AK Party been strong at home. If AK Party was strong at home today, it could have taken risks. It could have easily said, okay, I will bring the protocols to the parliament without putting a precondition, such as Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan. Why is AK Party not able to do that? Because AK Party, I think, has already lost a lot of political capital. And here we need to understand that the interlinkage between the Kurdish opening and the Armenian opening. The Kurdish opening, the so-called Kurdish opening, which was about democratization, ended with total failure. We're not sure if the Armenian opening will end up with total failure, but we can already say that the Kurdish opening ended with failure because basically there is this sense in AK Party today that the amnesty proposal and the return of PKK militants, which were greeted as heroes by Kurdish families at the border, basically brought back this memory of this fear of disintegration in Turkey. There is this fear that Kurds basically have their nationalist project, that they want to establish their own state, which is not very different than the perception the Unionists had about the Armenian issue. The Armenians want their own state, and that they will rebel against, that they are about to rebel against the state. There's this fear of Kurdish nationalism, and MHP, CHP, the two opposition parties, basically took the what happened at the border in Habur when the PKK militants crossed the border about 6 months ago, and their greetings by Kurdish families as a sign of weakness of Turkey. How AK Party basically selling out the country, giving amnesty to the Kurds, and this is the beginning of the end in terms of a Kurdish state emerging in the region. And that put a hold on the Kurdish initiative. Not only put a hold, but the MHP's vote started to increase, according to opinion polls. Today we're at a stage where the MHP is competing with AK Party in central Anatolia, in traditional constituencies of the AK Party, and the top priority of the AK Party has become not to allow MHP to win political capital, to win more votes on this Armenian opening, because the MHP is very opposed to the Armenian opening. The CHP is also very opposed. So AK Party is fighting for the nationalist vote. The country is in a kind of election mode already, and AK Party is likely to lose substantial votes compared to the 47% that they received in 2007. So therefore, Erdogan, the prime minister, does not feel strong at home, does not feel that he has enough cushion room to push through the to the parliament the Armenian opening. This is why I think more than the linkage with Azerbaijan itself, he's reluctant to give more ammunition to the nationalist camp. That is in itself very important, and it explains to a certain degree why Turkey reacted the way it did to Armenian Constitutional Court's decision. If you follow these matters closely, you will realize that for Armenia, it was a very big step for President Sarkisyan to argue that there could be a question mark in the form of the way the protocols have formulated it, to argue that there could be a question mark behind what happened in 1915 was a very big step. I mean, this was for a big compromise for Armenia. Let me refer to the language that exists in the two protocols in terms of understanding the difficulty and to understand something that I referred to at the beginning of my talk, this clash between the diaspora and Armenia itself. Because as you know, Sarkisyan was very much criticized by the diaspora for having agreed to the protocols. The protocol says that there should be an implementation of a dialogue on the historical dimension with the aim to restore mutual confidence between the two nations, including an impartial and scientific examination of the historical records and archives to define existing problems and formulate recommendations. This is what is commonly referred to as the historical commission. Basically, that there would be a historical commission to discuss what happened in 1915. What Turkey does not understand, I think, is that for a president of Armenia and for Armenia as a nation to accept that there should be a historical commission, to put a question mark behind 1915, is a huge compromise, a huge step in terms of basically the limits of what they can do. This is why Sarkisyan was alienated so much by the diaspora, and he basically lost also a member of his coalition. And there was a big question whether the Armenian Constitutional Court would find the two protocols in harmony with the Armenian constitution, whether it would basically give a green light for these two protocols. And after a number of months of examination, the Armenian Constitutional Court basically said that they are giving a green light, but that this should not mean that Armenia will give up its right to pursue genocide recognition, which is part of the constitution. And this gave Turkey the opportunity to say, aha, see, they're still after genocide recognition. Maybe the protocols do not talk about the genocide. They don't put genocide recognition as a precondition. But as the Constitutional Court confirmed, they still are pushing for this. And that the language of the Constitutional Court gave Turkey the excuse to say, wait a minute, there's a problem on the Armenian side. What they're doing is not in accordance with one of the sentences in the protocols, which talks about reiterating their commitment to refrain from pursuing a policy incompatible with the spirit of good neighborly relations. So in other words, Turkey argued that what the Armenian Constitutional Court said, despite the green light, is showing that this is not within the spirit of the protocols. So basically this kind of reading of what happened by the Constitutional Court, I think, was a big problem, because it showed that Turkey was not serious about implementing the protocols. To cling to such an element, to such language coming from the Armenian Constitutional Court in order to show that Armenia has bad faith in this, that they're not acting in accordance with the spirit of the protocols, was basically to ignore that Turkey itself had put preconditions about Nagorno-Karabakh, and was also in total disregard of the political reality of Armenia. I mean, basically, to imagine that just because there are these two protocols and that there's a historical commission about 1915, somehow Armenia will forget about genocide recognition, forget about 1915, was something, I guess, that Turkish diplomats, the Turkish government started to really believe in seriously, and this was not the case. Of course, Armenia was going to continue for genocide recognition. That's part of the identity of the country, that's part of the constitution, that's part of basically the whole political agenda of the country. That the protocols should not be tied to this was the agreement. Therefore, I think that Turkey failed to understand the political context of Armenia. and failed to understand that the Armenian Constitutional Court was just giving cover to President Sarkisyan in terms of allowing him to say, look, we will implement the protocols, but of course this doesn't mean that we're giving up on our collective memory. I think things unraveled from there. In the United States, there was a perception that Turkey was not serious about the protocols, and the last episode with the House Foreign Relations Subcommittee passing the Armenian Genocide Resolution, the non-binding Armenian Genocide Resolution, put things on hold in Turkey. So we are at a stalemate, we are at a deadlock. The question is there a way out of this? What can be done? And before coming here, I watched a long interview with Ahmet Davutoğlu on Turkish TV, which was a couple weeks ago. And Ahmet Davutoğlu's main point was to argue that there are essentially three dimensions to the problem. There is a psychological dimension, he said, to this issue. There is a legal dimension, and there is a historical dimension. What was missing, I think, was to realize that there is a very strong political dimension to this. I mean, Turkey needs to show that it has the political will to implement this. Armenia basically is the party that appears to have compromised on these protocols. Why? What is the big Armenian compromise? Just what I said, to put a question mark behind 1915 and to basically agree that genocide recognition should not be a precondition. What is the Turkish compromise? Where is the Turkish compromise? That's the big question. That's the political dimension. Turks basically are getting, in my opinion, what they wanted. Erdogan sent a letter to Koçaryan in 2005, which said, we want a historical commission about what happened in 1915. And Armenia was reluctant to say, okay, we'll consider this. They finally said, okay, let's have a historical commission, but let's also treat this as a general holistic issue by opening the border and establishing diplomatic relations. And Turkey said yes to this. This was not a compromise. This was what Turkey wanted, to have a historical commission. To open the border and to have diplomatic relations with Armenia should not be a compromise for Turkey. Turkey should be self-confident, in my opinion, to basically say that this is the right thing to do. By the way, if Turkey has concerns about whether Armenia respects Turkey's territorial integrity, which is also something that it was mentioned in the Turkish concern about the Armenian Constitutional Court's decision, because it referred to the Armenian Constitution, which apparently talks at one point about Western Armenia. And Turks consider this as basically a way of saying that Armenia does not recognize the Kars Treaty, 1921, I think. Then they have territorial ambitions. Well, the protocols itself indicate that the two countries confirmed the mutual recognition of existing borders. And they confirmed the territorial integrity of the two countries. So, in my opinion, if Turkey had the self-confidence to go ahead and to say, forget what the Armenian Constitutional Court is talking about. At the end of the day, they gave the green light. And forget about basically our concerns about whether they have territorial ambitions, etc. The protocols are very clear. Let's start with the protocols and let's see this as a process. Something that will create leverage for Turkey over Armenia down the line, which is something that could be helpful for Azerbaijan too, because if Turkey opens the border, if Turkey has more trade with Armenia, one can only think that this will strengthen Turkey's negotiation and Turkey's hand in terms of its leverage with Armenia. If the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, could put a positive dimension to what needs to be done, I think the political will be there. But right now it's missing. Right now we don't have the political will. And to look at this just through the angle of collective memory, psychology, would not be enough. But I'm afraid I'm pessimistic about what could happen because of the political season in Turkey, because of the dynamics that I just outlined. And I'm also concerned that there are limits to Armenia's patience. Sarkisyan has already compromised on a big issue, and they are waiting a response from Turkey. They are waiting a response from Turkey. They're in the next few months there has to be a strong signal coming from Turkey that either the protocols will be ratified, or that Turkey, because of the domestic situation in the country, will not be able to ratify them and will have to freeze the process only to reopen it after the elections. That, I'm not sure if that will be enough in terms of maintaining life for the process, having basically enough momentum for the process to continue. But something needs to be reiterated from the Turkish leadership. Otherwise, we may come very close to the end of this process, and we may end up with a situation worse than where we started. I'll just stop here and be happy to take questions.
Okay, I would like to start with the first question. If with the Kurdish initiative, the Kurdish opening, Turkish national identity is being questioned again. And do you think while you partly answered my question, but do you think if the timing was different, the timing of the Armenian rapprochement, do you think the outcome would be different?
The answer is yes. I think had AK Party not lost so much political nationalist capital because of the Kurdish opening, it could have been stronger at home. There are too many openings that AK Party has engaged in. The Cyprus opening, which caused them votes because it led to nowhere. The Kurdish opening, which caused them votes because it led to nowhere. Now Armenia, which is causing them basically problems. They need a victory. They need to show that one of their openings leads to positive results. On Cyprus, they're unable to show positive results. It's blocking, basically, relations with the European Union. The presence of Cyprus in the EU is blocking that. So there is this reference talking point to always, well, we did the right thing with the Annan plan, and the Greek Cypriots opposed it, therefore we're the victim now, and that's not going to win any points for AK Party, because AK Party is perceived as the country the part that compromised without getting much in return. Although I would disagree, because Turkey actually began accession negotiations thanks to its compromise on Cyprus. So Turkey got something in return, but it's very difficult to translate this into a political victory at home. On the Kurdish question, I think the timing was unfortunate. I mean, the fact that the Kurdish opening ended with the Constitutional Court deciding to ban the Kurdish party in Turkey, and this failure of the opening, and now AK Party retreating from some of its original narrative, at least, is also unfortunate. And the Armenian opening, the decision to basically link it to Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, also showed that Erdogan does not feel strong enough in Turkey in terms of the nationalist base of the party. Let's not forget what the AK Party is. I mean, liberal intellectuals such as myself support AK Party, but sometimes we forget that this is a political party that has a very strong nationalist base. The Turkish Islamic synthesis is what defines AK Party. Yes, it's a political party that has a strong Islamic root pedigree, but it is a political party that also has a very strong nationalist base. So it's very difficult for a political party like AK Party to basically compromise on so many issues simultaneously, on Cyprus, on the Kurdish question, on Armenia. There comes a point where they are really face-to-face with a nationalist base, which is saying, wait a minute, we're losing votes. We're losing the strongholds in central Anatolia. MHP is gaining ground. We've been in power for 7 years. So there are limits to what a Turkish Islamic synthesis-oriented party can do in terms of these very difficult issues.
Yes, the gentleman.
Dr. Taşpınar, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I had a question. And it regards the way that you framed the interaction game between these two actors. You said that Sarkisyan accepting a question mark was a compromise, and there has been basically no counterpart of this compromise on the Turkish side. Well, one could definitely frame the game a bit differently and say that there are two nationalistic myths, and Turkey has thrown more steps, technically, well, with accepting the formation of a commission, has thrown a step towards the deconstruction of this myth. and Armenia has been slower to throw that step, which would put the burden of reciprocation not on the Turkish but on the Armenian side. So isn't the framing of the issue here important? Thank you.
I don't follow exactly the logic, because Turkey basically for a long time argued that what happened in 1915 was just a massacre. Even Turkish documents refer to the fact that 200 to 300,000 Armenians were killed during these deportations. So there is a Turkish acceptance of what happened as a massacre. What Turkey does not accept is that it's a genocide, that there's an intention to annihilate the Armenian people, and Turkey basically wants the context to be part of the discussion. Therefore, what Turkey always wanted was a discussion on this matter, to get its own side to be heard. But 95% of academia accepts that what happened in 1915 was genocide, especially if we are to call much minor killings, massacres during the history of the 20th century as genocide. For instance, if we're going to call what happened in Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslims were killed by the Serbian army, a genocide, what happened in 1894 or 1895, just in Adana, where during basically 5 days 20,000 Armenians were killed, itself is a genocide. Or what happened in Diyarbakir, even before 1915, something that Turks don't even talk about. We always focus on 1915, but we forget all the killings that happened in 1894, 1895, 1896. Those each could be called genocides. So therefore, basically, Armenia is showing compromise, is basically saying, okay, if you really want to discuss what happened, we'll give it a shot. We agree to this, which is a huge step if you're an Armenian. If your whole identity is based on genocide, if the whole existence of basically the diaspora in the United States, in France, in Australia is based on this idea, and it's not a myth. For them, it's the reality. That's the reason why they're there. These myths that we can refer to.
It is the constructed reality for the Turks that was not genocide.
Yes, but I mean, for them, it's not a myth. The perception is that it's not a myth. I mean, they have parents killed, they have their families. I mean, for Turkey, let's not forget that Turkey, after all, emerged victorious. Turkey established a state. Turkey defeated the enemy. So there's a narrative of victory. Turks do not have this narrative of victimization. With Ataturk, there is a new state emerging, and Turks can be proud of what they have achieved. But the diaspora, or Armenia itself, they don't have these points of references that they can refer to as victory. So Turkey, in my opinion, should be a little bit more pragmatic and understand that we're dealing with a small state that is much more traumatized than we are, after all. Yes, we lost an empire, but we have established a very strong state. Turkey is the most successful case in the Islamic world, the most democratic, the most secular, the most developed. So we should be more self-confident. That's why I say Armenia compromised and Turkey did not.
Please identify yourself.
John Evans. I was previously U.S. Ambassador in Armenia. I want to thank the Rumi Forum for bringing everybody together today, and thank you, sir, for a very intelligent and balanced treatment of this complicated problem. There are lots of things that one could talk about today, but you raised one particularly urgent question, which is what next? And as I hear you speak, and I've heard many Armenian commentators also, neither side is very happy with these protocols. And one can say that maybe Turkey was naive to think that Armenia would cease looking for universal recognition of the genocide, but I think one could just as easily say that the Armenians were naive to think that there wasn't basically some linkage with Nagorno-Karabakh. So one can point fingers at either side, and both sides, when they look at the actual language, can find difficulties. I think it's useful to make a distinction between the simple legal question of diplomatic relations and the question of reconciliation, which is a much bigger, more complicated, and more difficult task. Reconciliation between societies, between nations, is one thing. The simple fact of diplomatic relations does not say I agree with you. I mean, we had, for God's sake, diplomatic relations and even an alliance with Stalin. And a modern example is Russia and Japan, which enjoy diplomatic relations, although they terribly disagree about the whether you call them the Kuril Islands or the Northern Territories. I think what has happened here is that because there's a lack of trust between the two sides and there are some desires to gain an advantage, more was put into these two protocols than the traffic will really bear. And the simplest thing of all occurs to every professional diplomat, and that is simply to have an exchange of notes without any of these other things. And I think that if the protocols now come crashing down one way or another, well, they may not, because what's interesting is that at each of these tension points, last April 22nd, then the end of August, which was just before the 6 weeks needed before the football game in Bursa, and then October 10th, at each of these moments, the two sides have gone forward. But if the protocols come crashing down for one reason or another, what I would suggest is that both sides forget for now, given the election timing and so on, about the more, shall we say, the more ambitious agenda, and just establish diplomatic relations, which does not imply losing any position on either side. After all, Turkey has a lot of strains in its relations with Athens, but has enjoyed diplomatic relations all these years, admittedly within the context of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering if you see any prospect of that very simple solution at present. Thank you.
Yeah. What you're proposing, Ambassador, is a very pragmatic step. Establish diplomatic relations. I presume it would also entail opening the border. And because once you do this, you argue, doesn't mean that you have solved the problems. You have a process of reconciliation that can run parallel to that. Let's not put basically diplomatic relations, let's not take diplomatic relations hostage to the reconciliation process. And one could argue that this is basically a very pragmatic, rational step to be taken. After all, you gave the example of Athens, Ankara, and Turkey and Greece had diplomatic relations, despite the fact that they had territorial disputes over the Aegean, despite the fact of Cyprus, etc. More importantly, with Syria. For a very long time, Syria had territorial ambitions over Turkey. Most of the Syrian official maps showed Hatay, Alexandretta as a Syrian province. Yet Turkey had diplomatic relations with Syria. The problem, it seems to me, at this point is political will. These rational decisions, rational proposals are there, and they sound very rational. The question becomes, what is feasible for Erdogan? Because what will happen now, the minute he has, let's assume that he will follow this policy, open the border with Armenia or establish diplomatic relations. The opposition will say, wait a minute, aren't you the person who were just 4 months ago in Azerbaijan saying that there should not be the opening of the border or not compromise with Armenia without progress in Nagorno-Karabakh? Where is progress in Nagorno-Karabakh? What did we get? He can simply not afford that kind of narrative coming from MHP at an election season. If he was stronger, if this was Erdogan in August 2007, after having won 47% of the vote, if this was Erdogan agreeing to the Annan plan in 2004 and saying we will be one step ahead of our of the countries that we're negotiating with, he would do it. But right now, he doesn't feel that he has this kind of comfort, this kind of cushion to win an electoral victory against MHP. And in my opinion, the whole Azeri dimension comes second to the domestic political dynamics in Turkey. He will use Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan as one example, as one element, but deep down the real challenge that he's facing is that the minute he says yes to opening the border and diplomatic relations, he will not be, he will be losing this reputation for being a politician who has strong nationalist credentials and who remains loyal to his word, because after all, he's the same person who created all these obstacles for himself. And I think what you're arguing to conclude is very logical. You can have diplomatic relations. That doesn't mean that reconciliation, this psychological dimension, should come before diplomatic relations. But I think such pragmatic proposals need to pass the test of political feasibility right now in Turkey, and the political feasibility is simply not there.
But wasn't the whole issue of tying the whole Armenian-Turkey rapprochement to Azerbaijan, wasn't it part of the domestic political calculation? I mean, it wasn't a geopolitical decision. It wasn't a
Look, there are ways to spin this. I mean, if I were a Turkish diplomat, I would say, look at the protocols. It refers to regional peace, stability. So of course, as the ambassador said, of course Nagorno-Karabakh should be part of this. Of course, one needs not mentioning that Nagorno-Karabakh should be even part of this, because our relations with Armenia are very difficult to imagine, to contemplate without the whole Caucasus dimension. So one can easily spin this and say, of course it's part of geostrategy, etc. What I'm arguing is that beyond this geostrategical argument, beyond this kind of elements that would make Turkey look better in terms of pursuing a more visionary policy than it is, the reality of Turkish politics is that AK Party has lost a lot of votes because of this opening and because of the Kurdish opening. And they're not able to really afford this kind of openings at a time when unemployment is high in Turkey, the economic situation is not good, they've been in power for so long, and the opposition seems to be gaining ground, especially if there is a CHP-MHP coalition. They can establish basically a political government, and AK Party can be the opposition party. This is a nightmare scenario for AK Party. And they really calculate this extra 5% or 2% or 3% they can get by being tough on these issues, because this is the vote that could otherwise go for MHP.
No, actually we're saying the same thing. So adding Azerbaijan to the whole equation, it was basically to get MHP votes, to get the nationalist votes, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, of course there's a strong Azeri lobby in Turkey, and there are people who really think that this should be, that's why I was saying Azerbaijan should be genuinely part of this process, and they genuinely believe that. But had there been political leadership which would have said, look, my relations with Armenia and my relations with the United States, by the way, are more important than just these nationalist votes, I can always basically afford to explain this to my Azeri brothers and to convince them that what we are doing is good for the region. Because Erdogan could have easily decided that actually Nagorno-Karabakh has been a problem for the last 13, 14 years. Nothing has changed. Turkey has closed the border, and we have seen that in the last 15 years, nothing has changed. Time to try something new. We will increase our leverage over Armenia, and you will see, maybe now they're reluctant, but in 1 year I will give you guarantees that they will actually change their position. And we will make sure through our partners in the United States, through our leverage with Armenia, that they change their position. For that to happen, however, I need to have diplomatic relations with Armenia. This could have been a different kind of political leadership, in my opinion, a more statesman-like position, because to try something new over what has not worked for the last 15 years. He hasn't done that. Instead, he immediately said Nagorno-Karabakh is part of the process, because he sensed that this is something that could potentially cost votes in the ballot box.
Yes.
Emre Küçükkaya, GW, and also SETA Foundation. Could you briefly mention Russia's position on this issue? It seems to me that Russia has good reasons actually not to support the Turkish-Armenian rapprochement, since it would kind of decrease their domination on Yerevan. But on the other hand, Sergei Lavrov was the one that played a vital role in pushing Nalbandian for signing the protocol during the negotiations in Switzerland?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to really have a definitive image of definitive idea of what is the Russian position on this. When you look at the statements on record, Lavrov and Russian leadership, Medvedev, have argued that normalization between Armenia and Turkey is a good thing. So they support the protocols, and they want this not to be linked to other issues. So there seems to be a convergence between the message coming from Washington and the message coming from Moscow. The complicating factor is that we have to understand what would be the Azeri position in all this. Because if Azerbaijan, if what we hear from Azerbaijan in the Turkish press, in the Turkish perception is that if Turkey passes the protocols, if Turkey basically has diplomatic relations with Armenia and opens the border, this will create major resentment in Azerbaijan. And there's this perception that Azerbaijan will be very angry with Turkey and may look at options in the region and a kind of realignment of Azeri policy. Now, to what degree this is real, this is perceived, but in any case, there is such a perception in Turkey. And in the Turkish talking points with Americans, there is this always concern about, we would be happy to pass the protocols, but you should understand that if we pass the protocols, we may lose Azerbaijan. That's part of the Turkish talking point. So losing Azerbaijan means what? If you're Russian, does that mean that in Azerbaijan that is angry with Turkey, that is angry with its Western partner, what kind of options would they have? So there's this perception that they may go more pro-Russian, that it may be good for Russia. So therefore there's this realpolitik calculation. Wouldn't Russia benefit from Azerbaijan turning against Turkey? Azerbaijan. So you get into these calculations, and then you question about whether Moscow is really sincere in wanting the passage of the protocols, because that would mean Azerbaijan would show a harsh reaction, and that may be good for Moscow, because that would mean Turkish-Azeri relations are deteriorating, and that Azeri-Russian relations are getting better. I mean, this may be too simplistic. It may not reflect the whole calculation, but it gives you an idea of the complexity of the situation. So in many ways, I think the Russian position on record is a positive one. They support reconciliation, normalization of relations. However, to what degree they're really sincere, I'm not sure. Of course, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the fact that Russia has a more aggressive policy in the Caucasus. Why is Armenia, after all, so willing? That's the big question that we should ask ourselves, too. Why is Armenia willing to sign these protocols? Why do they want normalization with Turkey? We know why Turkey wants it. I mean, zero problems with neighbors, to avoid major problems with the United States. There are many dimensions for Turkey to accept that Turkey is getting what it wants, after all, historical commission. What's in it for Armenia? I think the Armenian position, and here I'd be interested in someone who could be more articulate on this or have more insight. In my opinion, Armenia doesn't want to depend on Russia. Armenia wants a Western corridor for itself. Armenia wants basically, after it has seen what happened to Georgia in 2008, it no longer wants to be basically, it doesn't want to put all its eggs into the Russian basket. So for Armenia, this opening to the West, if there's an Armenia opening in Turkey, there's a much more serious Turkey opening in Armenia, and that makes strategic sense. And that would improve relations with the United States, that would improve relations with Turkey, down the line maybe the European Union, and down the line also it may create legitimacy for a solution in Nagorno-Karabakh. One thing that I think is important is that not to forget that the current leadership of Armenia is from Karabakh itself. They are not Western Armenians, they're Eastern Armenians. And they are people who fought in Nagorno-Karabakh and have won. Therefore, they have a sense that they have achieved victory, and this allows them to be, to a certain degree, more pragmatic. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they're not as traumatized by the legacy of the genocide, because I think they still carry the weight of the genocide on their shoulders, but they can be more pragmatic on the question of genocide because they have won in Nagorno-Karabakh. And that allows them to be more pragmatic. That's one other factor why I think if Turkey has a chance to normalize relations with Armenia, it may do it under a leadership that comes from Karabakh rather than another leadership that puts the genocide question as a precondition. So that's why we're facing a kind of historical opportunity here with someone like Sarkisyan that may not be there in the future if there's a new Armenian leadership that wants to put actually genocide recognition as a precondition.
Russia, this is how I see. Russia might be sincere in its support for the reconciliation, and its strategy might be to use improved relations with Turkey to keep US, EU, and other extra-regional actors away from the South Caucasus. And I think another motivation might be to isolate Georgia more. So, so that might be, so Russia might be actually quite pragmatic in its support. Questions? Okay, we'll have one more question, please.
I'm Armen Kharazian, a former Armenian diplomat, now with Global Key Partners, a strategic consultancy firm here in DC. Dr. Taşpınar, thank you for your presentation, one of the most intellectually sound and strong articulations on the subject. In speaking about Prime Minister Erdogan's thinking about this subject, you mentioned three dimensions that his thinking has evolved in relation to that: psychological, humanitarian, and ideological dimensions. And you correctly noticed that missing from that list was the political dimension. I would like to ask if you could articulate a little bit about the national security dimension of this whole subject of Armenian-Turkish normalization, since we all know, if we're interested in finding out how really this realistic a progress is down the road, we know that it is interests rather than ideas that guide actions of states. And whether you would think you would define national security, the national security rationale, in terms of some sort of a composite measure of the three mentioned dimensions: psychological, ideological, and humanitarian, or there's something more to it than the totality of those three. Thank you.
Actually, I think the way Turkey approaches this question with Armenia, especially the 1915 and the US dimension, is with a slogan: "Leave history to historians." So there's this historical dimension, right, that Turkey needs to emphasize, and it should not be the job of politicians to judge history. And here, too, there's a political dimension, because if your slogan will be "Leave history to historians," then one would assume that historians would be free to discuss freely these issues, that there should not be political or legal interference with conferences that talk about 1915. My experience is that last time there was a serious attempt to bring Armenian scholars, international scholars, Turkish scholars for a conference on what happened in 1915, the Ottoman Armenians issue. The Minister of Interior, it was, I think, Cemil Çiçek, who was Deputy Prime Minister, basically used very strong narrative and said, those people are stabbing, those academics are stabbing the nation from the back, from behind. So that tells you that if the political context is not there for freedom of speech, for democracy, the slogan "Leave history to historians" is hollow, because you need to have the freedom to discuss these things. If you have Article 301, which puts question people who basically signed this kind of petitions, which apologize for the great catastrophe, into legal problems, then the slogan of "Leave history to historians" needs to pass the test of whether historians and analysts are free to discuss what happened. So there's a political dimension to all this, which should not be forgotten. Your question about national security dimension, I think that's very much part of the Turkish trauma as well. It saddens me in a way to hear intelligent Turkish diplomats to argue that, you know, if there is a genocide bill in Congress, if there is a non-binding genocide resolution in the U.S. Congress, that would have major implications for international law. That somehow there would be territorial and financial compensation demands coming from Armenia. That Turkey would be in a very difficult situation if there is such a genocide passage in the US Congress, because it would basically create momentum for this discussion of genocide and the implications, the ramifications of being a country that has committed genocide in terms of the financial and territorial compensations. Here, it saddens me because it shows the lack of self-confidence in Turkey. Is Turkey really concerned that a small country like Armenia or the Armenian diaspora can really do such serious damage to Turkey in terms of territorial and financial demands? I mean, if we are dealing with this very strong Turkish self-confidence narrative of basically being a strong country, a regional superpower in the region, why is Turkey so afraid? Genocide in itself would be a bad thing. I mean, to basically attaching the label of a country having committed genocide would be very difficult to swallow for Turkish pride. But to constantly refer to the national security dimension of this issue, that there will be territorial demands coming from Armenia and from the Armenian diaspora, and financial demands on the grounds that a similar model which was applied to the Holocaust would be applied to this, to me shows that there is this lack of confidence. Having said that, it would seriously help to diffuse such Turkish fears, because Turks seriously believe that genocide recognition is just the first step of a process, that somehow, and that brings the trauma dimension, somehow this will be the beginning of territorial disintegration, that if the Armenians want this, you end up with other minorities of Turkey who will also say, guess what, we were massacred too, and we want our land. The Kurds may take this as an example, and after all, when the Swedish parliament passed the Armenian genocide resolution, they referred to, correct me if I'm wrong, to six different ethnic minorities in Turkey, the Laz, Cherkess, etc. All of them were subject to genocide. So that's the Turkish fear of a national security concern, that somehow Armenia would establish a precedent and would unravel the process of Turkey's disintegration, that somehow this would basically cost so much in terms of Turkey's prestige, but also territorial and financial dimension. Therefore, you attach to this a kind of national security dimension, and you disable it. Therefore, you become unable to discuss the whole psychological dimension, to empathize with Armenia, to empathize with the Armenian narrative, because after all, if you give them an inch, it will unravel and you will lose everything. So the national security dimension that you mentioned, which is part of the political reality of Turkey, which is part of the traumatized mindset of Turkey, which is there with Armenia, but also there with the Kurds, is a big obstacle. And it would really help if at the official level, somehow Armenia could declare that when they refer to Western Armenia, or when they refer to Mount Ararat, they don't have territorial ambitions over Turkey. And this is a very big question, because when I went to Yerevan 5 years ago, I gave a speech very similar to this one. I came close to basically saying, look, I mean, you know, I'm just an independent analyst in Turkey. For what it's worth, I would like to apologize for what happened in 1915. So I read something very similar to this apology petition. And I gave a speech saying that Armenia should support Turkey's EU membership, that Armenia should do what Greece did in 1999, which is becoming a supporter of Turkey's EU membership. Instead of putting genocide recognition as a precondition for Turkey's EU membership, Armenia should be supportive of democratization, freedom of speech in Turkey, and that a European Turkey would be a country that would be more willing to apologize for what happened in 1915. And I thought I'd given a very progressive speech, and I thought that my Armenian friends, and this was in a think tank and with lots of Armenian students, would appreciate that. They came to me and said, You get high points for being such a progressive Turkish independent analyst. We appreciate that. You really gave a good speech. But you know what? An apology would not be enough. We really want the mountain. We really want compensation. You're a big country. What is the meaning for you of Mount Ararat? For us, it's our symbol. It's our identity. When I heard that, I said to myself, my God, if I had a few MHP people here in the room with me listening to this, this would confirm their worst nightmare. I hope those young Armenians that I talk to do not represent the majority of Armenia, because if there is this belief in Armenia that reconciliation with Turkey somehow would require Mount Ararat becoming Armenian territory, or that Turkey would be strong enough to make such a gesture, this is not going to happen. But because there was such a reaction in that speech, to my speech, I always started thinking that maybe Turkey's national security trauma and concern and paranoia has some validity. If this is coming from young Armenians, one can only think of basically people who have some anger and vengeance and who would like such things, who would dream about basically territorial demands from Turkey. It would really help if Armenia could make a statement that they have no territorial ambitions over Turkey, that they basically do not want territorial or financial compensation. Because if there is a financial compensation dimension to this, this would only make it more difficult for Turkey to come to terms with what happened in 1915.
Well, I think do we have time? Or, I'm sorry, we don't have time. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Ömer. Thanks to the Rumi Forum for organizing this.